the most famous textual problem of the Bible, the story of the woman caught in adultery, or known to scholars as the pericope adulteri or pericope de adultera. This is John chapter 7, verse 53 through John 8:11. It's 12 verses long, and I would call this my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. It's a passage that many people regard as their favorite passage in all of Scripture. But we're going to try to look at this historically, and we'll talk about why it's important to do that. But I want to begin by pointing out that it's a distinction needs to be made between what is canonical and what is historical. Is it possible for a story about Jesus to be true without it being part of the New Testament? Of course. At the same time, what you often get among evangelical scholars is, wait, I can't trust this because it's not inspired. So they think the only thing that's true is what's inspired. And they say, if I don't have an inspired Bible, then the whole Bible is untrustworthy. And I'd say that's just a silly position to hold. Josephus is not inspired, yet we regard a lot of what he has to say as accurate historically. It just means that we have to do more work in these things. But here's a passage that if this is not part of inspired Scripture, then we need to examine it historically, especially, and see if it is something that actually was true. Respect for the author requires that we investigate dubious passages seriously. If John didn't write this, then to throw this into his gospel would be an offense to him. Some authors are extremely particular about changing their text. J.R.R. Tolkien was famous for that, for even the spelling of the plural of some words that he had made up. He said, no, you can't spell it this way. This is exactly how it has to be. Other authors are particular that way too. Some of us are very fussy when somebody tries to monkey around with our text. To add a dozen verses right in the middle of John's gospel that he did not write, if that's the case, would be a serious affront to our respect for the human author and therefore to the divine author, because you have dual authorship of Scriptures. The incarnation of Jesus Christ gives us a methodological imperative to do serious historical research. And one of the things that we have in the evangelical community is often a pitting of incarnation versus inspiration. It's Christ versus the Bible. And all too often, Christ comes out the loser in the way we approach the text. Because the incarnation says, let's examine this stuff historically. Let's really do rigorous research in this. And inerrancy says, hands off my Bible. Don't ask those tough questions, because I hold to inerrancy and I'm not allowed to think that the Bible might have an error in it. Well, what we are allowed to think is that we have to do this historical research. And this is not an issue that even affects inerrancy, but it does affect whether these 12 verses are inspired or not. So this really, the intertwining of how we think of our theological priorities is weighted in this passage pretty significantly. Now there's a lot of emotional baggage that's attached to the pericope adulteri. PA are the initials that scholars call this by. More emotional baggage attached to this passage than to any other passage in the New Testament. If it's not part of the New Testament, what do we actually lose? Do we lose Jesus forgiving people? No, of course not. He forgives people in other places. But we do lose a fascinating story about him forgiving either a prostitute or at least a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. Now, this pericope may well be true historically, even if John did not write it. And we'll wrestle with that towards the end here. So an examination of the evidence is therefore in order. All right. Again, we'll start with the external evidence here just to make things a little bit easier for us. And here's some fascinating things about this. I'm going to summarize this pretty quickly, though. In terms of external evidence, this passage is missing in our two oldest manuscripts for this portion of John, P66 and P75. That's huge. There's no way you could accidentally add these 12 verses or omit them. And so for them to be lacking in these two papyri is very, very important. It's also missing in Aleph and B. Now, frankly, I don't know if there is any place where P66, P75, Aleph, and B agree without any asterisk, without any corrections done, that I would disagree with that reading. I think that is so rock solid. It's virtually the end of the discussion. You don't always have them agree. Very infrequently do they agree on everything, at least of important variants, but here seems to be an important one. And Codex A, which in the Gospels, you remember, is a Byzantine manuscript. It's Alexandrian outside the Gospels. So here we have our earliest Byzantine manuscript that lacks the story of the woman caught in adultery. And then Codex C, which is kind of secondary Alexandrian, also lacks it. And almost all manuscripts through the 8th century lack this story. So for the first 800 years of the church, we've got this story only represented in a handful of manuscripts. 3 to date have it. 3 majuscule manuscripts. These are not just 8th century. I mean, D is 5th, but K and Gamma are later. And so we have 3 majuscule manuscripts out of the 322 that we have that actually have this passage. That's it. The earliest and the best versions lack it. So once the text of John got translated in various languages, they didn't come back and say, oh, let's go back and look at Greek manuscripts to see what they have to say. What it's telling us is that when the Syriac and the Coptic and the Latin versions along those lines don't have it, when they were begun in the 2nd and 3rd century, their manuscripts that they used didn't have it. That becomes a very important point. So we've got this early and widespread lack of these 12 verses. And then we have a lack of patristic comments on this passage until the 12th century. Not until the 1100s do you get somebody that takes any time to really comment on this text. Are we going to insist that these verses are authentic when you don't see it in the early versions, you don't see it in the early fathers, you don't see it in any fathers of the first millennium, and you don't see it in the most important manuscripts? And then of those manuscripts that do have it, there are several that have an asterisk in the margin. What an asterisk indicates, and this goes back to the Alexandrian scribal habits, is I have doubts about whether this passage is authentic. Now, Maurice Robinson tries to argue that asterisks indicate that it's not part of the lectionary reading. And he even says in one place that the earliest manuscripts we have that have asterisks in them is from the 8th century. But that's not true. We find them in Codex Claromontanus, where the asterisks definitely mean this passage is probably doubtful. Codex Claromontanus is a 6th century manuscript, and I know it has the asterisk because I examined that manuscript 3 years ago. It's a Codex D of Paul and the Epistles. It's a different Codex D than the one for the Gospels and Acts. So it occurs in these earlier manuscripts as well. And then we have corruptions within the pericope adultery. What I mean is the text itself is not stable. This has been called the most corrupted passage of any pericope in the Gospels. That the text just goes all over the map. What exactly are these 12 verses saying? The earliest manuscript we have, Codex D, that has them, is not at all like the Byzantine manuscripts that have it. There's a lot of changes that take place. You have Jesus writing in the dirt, in all the manuscripts, of course, but some of the manuscripts actually tell us what he wrote. And there's a dispute as to what he wrote. So you have whole groups of families that are going in different directions on that. It's pretty funny to look at. But the very fact that we have so many corruptions within the pericope adultery tells us that this may well be a floating oral story that got spread about in different forms for quite some time. And speaking about floating, it is a floating text as far as the New Testament is concerned. Let me show you some of the places this passage has shown up, and let's wrestle with what the implications of that are. It appears in 3 different places in John 7, not just John 7:53, but a couple places earlier. In some manuscripts, it appears as a separate pericope at the end of all 4 Gospels, just tacked on at the very end. Some manuscripts, it stands as an independent pericope between Luke and John. But what does all this tell us? Is it stable in this place? No, it's not stable. That suggests that here's a passage that's trying to get into the Bible, and it's tried several different places to get in, if you can personify this, and finally it landed on John 7:52. Right after that seemed to be the most logical, the most coherent place. It seems that fits into the text pretty well, and yet there's still some real serious issues there. And it also occurs in one manuscript after John 8:12. This is fascinating. It's Codex 115, and it's one that Griesbach actually was one of the very first guys to collate. I collated it several years ago. And what I noticed is here's the manuscript. It shears off at John 11, right in the middle of John 11. But the scribe copying out this manuscript gets to this pericope. And he's copying from another manuscript. He writes out John 7:52. Then he continues copying from this other manuscript and writes out John 8:12. The manuscript that he's copying from, it's a 10th century manuscript, so it's not particularly early. The manuscript he's copying from does have some early Western readings, and it's really got some interesting things going on. All of a sudden, it skips the story of the woman caught in adultery. This scribe doesn't catch it until he writes the verse after this pericope. And so he catches it. He goes, oh, wait a minute, that's not right. This story is supposed to go here. So he goes and puts that manuscript down, picks up another one that has the story of the woman caught in adultery, and writes it out. This is the only manuscript I know of where you have the story of the woman caught in adultery after John 8:12, and then John 8:12 is again repeated after it. And you can see how it came about. The question I have yet to answer is, when he writes out this story, does he go back to his original manuscript? Or does he stay with his new manuscript? And it would take a little bit of work. Maybe I'll assign that to a student to do as a master's thesis. Just fun to find out what these scribes were doing. At some point we'll know what he had for lunch too. So this is a floating text, and what's really interesting is it comes in some manuscripts after Luke 21:38, at the end of Luke 21, which is the Passion Week for the Lord. John 8 is not. That's earlier in Jesus' ministry. We'll talk about the significance of it being after Luke 21:38 later, but I have long suspected that if this passage is authentic, that's actually where it belongs. We'll talk about that. Now, sometimes you see scribes that get very upset if the passage is not put in there where they expect it to be. And so here's a medieval parchment manuscript that we photographed some years ago. And it's a parchment manuscript, but you have this paper leaf that has been stitched into the next parchment leaf. Not stitched into the binding, not made out of parchment. All the evidence here is this scribe is ticked. He's angry that this parchment manuscript does not have the story of the woman caught in adultery. And so what does he do? By golly, that belongs in my Bible, so I'm going to stitch this in. Look at this, 5 big stitches. I mean, it's like Goliath putting this thing together. And he's stitching it in, writes it out on this side, and finishes it on the back side, so it goes into his Bible. What's interesting is on the back side of this, you have a child's handwriting of the story of the woman caught in adultery right after it. I suspect this was some pastor someplace. He was upset. The story's not in there, and he's talking about it at dinner. Man, that story belongs in there. So his 8-year-old kid comes and says, yeah, I'm upset too, so I'm going to write it out as well. So it's a hilarious thing. In the history and the annals of textual criticism, you really see the humanity of these scribes when you see that kind of thing, the manuscripts. Well, I told you that some of these manuscripts have an asterisk there, and the asterisk is indicating that the manuscript or that text is not authentic. Here in Codex 1424, we see asterisks in the margin down here of this text. So you got the text actually written out, but then you've got asterisks saying, but it's not actually authentic, or that they have doubts about it. This is a manuscript at the Lutheran School of Theology that we photographed a few years ago. Very important manuscript, but significantly, those asterisks say the scribe is telling us he has doubts about the authenticity. Well, the internal evidence is that the vocabulary, the syntax, the style are not John's. You can see this if you've had a year, maybe a year and a half of Greek. Students have told me when they've read through, I try to get them to read as much as their New Testament as they can after their first year of Greek, and they're reading through John's Gospel and looking up, they have to look up every 10th word or so. The vocabulary is pretty simple, straightforward, wonderful writing, but on a simple level. And then all of a sudden they get to the story of the woman caught in adultery, and they're pulling out that dictionary. And the style is different, and it just doesn't feel like John. The way he even joins sentences, he uses one conjunction all the way through his gospel. There's a different conjunction that's used here. You don't change from using and to now or something like that just for 12 verses and then go back to your normal style. It just doesn't happen. There is no other single pericope in all of John's Gospel that's so anomalous in terms of the vocabulary, the syntax, the style. It disrupts the passage. I wrote an article that got published in New Testament Studies some years ago about reconsidering the reconsideration of the story of the woman caught in adultery. I think it has a bad title, but nevertheless, I was arguing that the internal evidence here suggests that this really is a disruption to the style of what's going on in John's passage and to the artwork he's trying to create. Now, what's really interesting is that the language is much more similar to Luke's gospel than it is to John's. So that brings me to an article that just got published about a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, by one of my former students, Kyle Hughes, in one of the most important journals for the New Testament in the world, Novum Testamentum, that is published in Holland. And he wrote this article called The Lucan Special Material and the Tradition History of the Pericope Adultery. Well, this just came out in Novum Testamentum 55 for the year 2013. This was a paper that Kyle originally did for me as a master's student at Dallas Seminary in the course Advanced Greek Grammar. And he wanted to do a paper that he said, I'd like to get something that could perhaps get me into a decent doctoral program. And so he said, I want you to put the screws to me, make me really work hard. So I said, well, here's a topic that I think really needs to be done. It's been a back burner topic of mine for years. I thought that Lucanisms looked more prominent in this passage than Johannisms. In other words, it looked more like Luke's style than John's. And I also wondered if Luke had access to a form of this, but not exactly these 12 verses. And so I told Kyle there's certain approaches you need to go through to do this. He wrote a marvelous paper. I really grilled him on it. And when a student says, grade me hard, that's my favorite thing to do, is to bleed all over your paper. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. And he did such an exceptional job on it that I urged him to go ahead and try to get it published. He also got into a really decent doctoral program because of this. And I think that the mystery of its origin may have been discovered in Kyle Hughes's work. He did far more work than I ever would have. I had the idea, but he's the one who implemented it. And here's what we've got. Recent excavations in Dura Europos reveal two different versions of this particular story that ended up getting conflated in the 3rd century. One was in the east, one was in the south. And now these two stories are what gets put into our gospel of John. The question that Kyle asked is, did Luke have access to one of these stories? There's several features in the pericope adultery that are found in Luke's special material. And by special material, it's material that we know that he used, that he himself didn't write. It's called L. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But for example, he talks about unnamed women who are in dire straits or not they're not shown in the best light, but he doesn't give them names. Luke himself, for those of you who know Greek, simply avoids the historical present. The historical present is using something in the present tense when you're talking in narrative. So if, like in John chapter 4, he said, you have Jesus says to the woman, and the woman says to him, and it goes on through like that. That's a historical present. We have 151 historical presents in Mark's gospel. We have 80 in Matthew's gospel, and we have 13 in Luke. There are 3 in this particular pericope. And I told Kyle, I said, that's the one problem I really have with this passage, is I don't think we're dealing with something that Luke would have written because he doesn't like the historical present. But what Kyle discovered is that all of the historical presents in Luke's gospel are found in his special material, all of them. And it's a much higher cluster, and so it fits into that. The verb forms, other things he discovered. It's fascinating what he found. So this raises a question. If Luke had a form of this, and he could have put it into his gospel, and the place where he would have put it in, and may have put it in an early draft and taken it out, would be right after Luke 21:38. Why didn't he include it in his published gospel? It's a good question. He has a special emphasis on women and God's grace towards women. Why doesn't he include this? I take it The reason he didn't is because we're dealing with a passage that in Luke's form, it was a little bit more bland than what we have in the conflated form. And here's what Kyle discovered and what I've sensed is probably the case. Most likely, the Pharisees did not peel off from the oldest to the youngest. That just looks like an apocryphal accretion that was added. Most likely, this woman was not caught in adultery. She was caught in some sin, and we just don't know exactly what it is. Almost surely Jesus did write something in the dirt, and precisely because the scribes are all saying, oh, maybe he wrote the Ten Commandments, maybe he wrote their sins. They're guessing what it is. It's that ambiguity in the text that suggests that it's authentic, see? There was actually a doctoral dissertation done at the University of Edinburgh by Christopher Keith, where he argued that the pericope adultery was put into John's gospel to show that Jesus knew how to write. Because the early Christian faith was often criticized because it was filled up with people who were literate, who could not read or write. And I think Keith is probably correct. And here's the only place you have Jesus writing something out, and the Greek verb suggests that it's actually words that he's writing. Don't know what those words are, though. But it probably didn't look as helpful as the current form that we now have in our later manuscripts. And so John's gospel did not have it originally, and Luke probably didn't have it because it just didn't have as much that we'd expect to see here. Well, let me give you a conclusion. The pericope adultery is almost surely not authentic. And now, when you begin to think about it, if you compare Mark 16 and John 8, and we'll look explicitly at the evidence in Mark 16 in just a minute. Mark 16 and John 8, those are the two longest passages that are of doubtful authenticity. I've done this over the years where I've been in churches and I've talked about the two passages, and I've said, how many of you would prefer to keep Mark 16 in your New Testament and get rid of John 8? In all the churches I've been in, I've had one person raise his hand that says, yes, he wants that. It was a former Muslim who really wanted to see more evidence for the resurrection. But almost everybody would prefer to have John 8. And yet, when you compare the manuscript evidence for these two, although I think it's compelling against Mark 16 being authentic, the evidence against John 8 being authentic is overwhelming. 20% of all of our manuscripts don't have it. Virtually all of them through the 8th century don't have it. We don't have any patristic commentaries till the 12th century. You know, the evidence just goes on and on and on. When you look at Mark 16, our two earliest manuscripts don't have it. Virtually all the others do in Greek, but then foreign language is a little bit different. So you say the evidence here for the authenticity of John 8 is not at all compelling. Mark 16, it's much more so. But on the basis of evidence, if I had to choose one of these two, Mark 16 would be in the Bible, John 8 would not be, if I had to choose. Years ago, my pastor gave a sermon one time on this story. And I wrote to him and I said, you know, I don't think this is an authentic passage. And he said, yeah, I know that there's some doubt about it, but it's such a great passage, I wanted to preach on it. And I'll just pray for that early manuscripts will be discovered. Well, I used to have that kind of an attitude too of, it's kind of like damn history, full speed ahead kind of a thing. Let's not look at what we really have in the data out there. Let's hope that things really are different from what we know them to be. Here's a text, the evidence is so overwhelming, it's not authentic. As much as we want it to be authentic, as much as we want it to be by John. And it reminds me of Edwin Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. When he wrote this, he was not a man who liked Christians or Christianity. And in his book, he has a little section on the story of the Trinitarian formula, 1 John 5:7. And he rattled the British when he said, well, this passage is not authentic. It's not in the earliest manuscripts of 1 John. And it really stirred up quite a furor among British Christians. Well, that was the late 1700s. 100 years later, you get the revised version to be published in 1881. It doesn't even have a footnote on 1 John 5:7. It just says, it's not authentic, we're not even going to deal with it. This is reminiscent of what Ehrman has been doing with his book, Misquoting Jesus, and what he's done in interviews, radio, TV, things like this, is he almost always uses the story of the woman caught in adultery as his very first story to talk about. Says, well, this probably didn't happen. John probably didn't write this. And he does it as a calculated shock effect. People gasp when they hear him say that. And what it tells me is these people aren't reading their Bibles. You look at almost any modern translation and they will say, most ancient authorities don't have this passage. But people don't look at their manuscript or their marginal notes in their Bibles. I really think that the passage needs to be relegated to the footnotes. Bart Ehrman has let the cat out of the bag. He's done a service for everybody. But you need to hear these things from believing professors, not from an unbelieving professor. And Ehrman and I would not disagree on this passage whatsoever, nor would the vast majority of evangelical scholars. Well, let me give you an epilogue that deals with incarnation and inspiration. As Christians, what should our priority be? Should it be on Jesus or the Scriptures? Well, we know what the answer is supposed to be, but it's supposed to be Jesus. But nowadays, I think things have gotten muddled. Part of the reason is we can't know Jesus apart from the Scriptures. We know that. But even if the Bible were not inspired, this would not mean that it would be historically worthless. There's grades of that. And again, I'm saying here's a text that I don't think is inspired, but I think it is largely historically true with some accretions added to it. The incarnation demands of us historical research, but many evangelicals' views of inerrancy argues against this. That is, we say we're not going to do this kind of research. Textual criticism is one of those areas where we're really examining this stuff, and it can rattle us on so many passages that we've looked at. It could be a little bit shocking to your system. And yet we're trying to deal with the evidence honestly because ultimately we are trying to honor Christ in the whole process. I want him to triumph in the end. And the evidence and the historical realities of what the text is about ultimately glorify him and honor him in ways that are unimaginable. But we cannot be the kinds of people who say, I'm going to hold to this text, this is the form of the text I want, because I like these verses better. That does not honor Jesus Christ. And that's really what we should be all about. Thank you again for your attention.